Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing all right today. So today I will talk to you about lessons learned from crafting a thriving vue.js SaaS application. It's a mouthful title, but that's what gets you in conferences, apparently. So um, I come from Egypt, so I flew 20 hours to get here, and I'm jet lagged to hell. So give me a, forgive me a bit if I'm a little confused today. So. My name is Abdelrahman Awad, and I started to hate my name here because it's very hard to explain how to say it, but you can call me Awad if it's easier for you, and let's leave it at that. I'm a senior engineer at Rasail and a Google developer expert in web technologies. I created vValidate for Vue.js, so if you have delved into Vue.js, okay, we have one user at least. So if you have used it and if you have dealt with forms, you probably heard about it. I also have a blog, logarithm.com, which I write mostly about Vue and front-end stuff. And I host a podcast called the Untyped Podcast. I wish it was in English. Unfortunately, it is in Arabic. So yeah. I also co-organize the EgyptJS meetup, which is similar to your meetups here, but back in Egypt. So I am talking to you today about some stuff that we learned and some stuff that mistakes we did with Vue and a whole slew of issues around building a SaaS application. In other words, I will talk to you about my main full-time job, and that's at Rasail. So let's clear things a bit. What does Rasail means as a word? It just means messages, right? So let's get that out of the way. And Rasail is just, you can see it as a way for businesses to communicate with their customers through WhatsApp, whether it's for sales or maybe customer support. So at its simplest, it's a fully featured real-time inbox. So a lot of real-time, a lot of data going back and forth, lots of data management, lots of components talking to each other, and that's just one part of it. On the other hand, Rasail also has Dynamic Bot Builder. And I know you are frustrated whenever you end up talking to a bot from customer support, right? So I'm sorry to be on that end of the people who are building these kinds of stuff, but that's my job. So we also have a Vue builder, a bot builder that uses Vue, and yeah, it's pretty visual, it's complicated, drags, lots of interactions, lots of things to do. Also, Rasail has a bunch of stuff like campaigns, a contact manager, reporting dashboard, AI conversational toolkit, because which companies doesn't participate in AI today, right? Like everyone wants to do AI in their application. So we do that, and it kind of makes sense for our use case because we can make AI answer customers and help them finish their queries and pretty much reach what they need. And we actually use it ourselves for the technical aspects of the application. Like it handles the technical parts of it and the technical issues that our customers may face. Also, it has CRM integrations, permission role system, and so much more. What I'm trying to say to you here, I'm not trying to sell Rasail to you. It's for companies. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is Rasail is a very large Vue application. And all of that is built with, I will start a theme here throughout the talk. I will show you a number, and you try to guess what it refers to, right? So we have 6, and that's the number of engineers we have today. And these 6 engineers have all mixed backgrounds, with me being more of a front-end expert and the others being more back-end leaning. It means we need to be very careful about what the bits that we need to do about the technologies we use and everything else around that. So it starts with a few bits for us. So of course, we bet on Vue.js. Why? First, because I am biased towards Vue.js. I like using Vue.js, so that's one reason. But the co-founders had a very positive experience with their previous business with Vue.js. So that's more like an alignment, so it works well for us. Another thing is, it's really easy to onboard people to Vue.js. Our engineers, who were mostly backend engineers, didn't face any issues picking that up. When you are in a new code base, what do you do most of the time? You copy stuff around, right? You mimic what other people have wrote, right? And Vue is really easy about that because Vue components the SFC component are separated into templates CSS styles, and script. And whenever one of these engineers have to fix a CSS issue, for example, or styling issue, they can Google that and they can fix it as a styling issue, and it doesn't have to do anything with Vue. Another bit is TypeScript. So I think it is critical that you use TypeScript in any application today because it gives you the ability to scale your application maintainability, because it's very hard to understand where everything is going, and at some point you lose track of that. You stop understanding how the data flows throughout your application. And that doesn't matter much. What matters is if you are able to tell what flows between these different parts, and TypeScript really helps with that. Also, the static type checking means it can basically fail a CI, right? Like it will fail in the CI, it will catch a lot of errors for us, and TypeScript for us has enabled us to avoid writing a lot of unit tests. If I know the output, the input and the outputs are fine, so I don't have to test that anymore. And this talk is full with a few hot takes like this one, so we can discuss them at the end. And then we have also GraphQL, and all these technologies play really well together because GraphQL, and it's not just because it's GraphQL, right? You can use anything other than GraphQL as long as you can generate types out of it. So we can generate types for the schema, for the entire API schema, and we can generate types for our queries, for our mutations, and their variables, and even the fragments that we use to query that API. And that means we can write components that instead of having to write TypeScript models ourselves, right? Most of us write models on the front end all the time, right? Because they get the data from the back end and then they have to map it to something more suitable for the front end or for your application. But we don't do that much because we try to make the modeling as much as possible on the GraphQL layer so that it is suitable for the front end. So we just use the fragments as props. We literally use the fragment types as props, and we don't try too much modeling on our TypeScript. So most of our TypeScript is actually generated. So that makes the maintenance much easier. Now, what I really like about TypeScript is anything that can go wrong will go wrong, right? Like it really enforces that mentality. If you have a number that could be a null, that could be undefined, then you have to handle it, right? You can't just leave it like that, unless you cast to any, which isn't something you should do. So I really like this law or quote, and I attribute it to TypeScript. So let's talk about some things that we actually did in our code, which is code structure. How do we organize our components? So Rasail has multiple deployment targets. So we have a web app, we have a mobile app, we have an iframe app, and we have and this is pretty much the structure that you can see right here. I didn't include the iframes for some reason, but it's like a monorepo. Each project has its own kind of dependencies, each project has its own kind of components and composables and so on, and even its own TS config and vite config. But at the same time, they all share some logic together. So we have a shared folder and they all import stuff from it, and yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't think it's too radical. It's something you will see in most open source libraries and even larger projects that utilize monorepos. So let's focus on components, right? Rasail is, I keep saying this, Rasail is a very large application. We have around 800 to 1,000 components, I think, and we wrote all of them. So how do we organize them? Well, the trick is we don't. So it's a flat structure, all 800 of them, but we follow some small rules in terms of naming them. For example, we use Pascal case names, and we make sure the names are tightly coupled. That means every component that has to do with each other, any related components will be in the same region because they are named the same. For example, we have something called the message composer, and then we have something called an attachment that would fit into that composer. So we would call both of them a message composer and a message composer attachment item. And that makes it really easy to just create components because we don't want to waste 1 second of figuring out what should I call this folder or where should this component live, because when you start creating folders in an unopinionated framework like Vue or React, you have to answer this question for your team. what's the criteria for creating a new folder? Is it domain-based kind of separation, or is it maybe region-based in the app? What are you separating based on? What's your criteria for separation? And we don't want to have a strict criteria because there isn't any. You can easily create a component and then realize you can use it elsewhere, right? And so moving them around, renaming them, and that just becomes too much of a headache. So we just do that. And it really works well as long as we keep these rules intact. It's not perfect, of course, as you would have guessed, because when the app grows to the size of something like a cell, like 1,000 components and that's just the web alone, and that becomes too much. So what we want to do, so we didn't do this yet, but what we think would work really well, given the time, is we separate components based on completely different criteria. So first, we have our design system components, and that includes stuff like forms, right? Avatars, menus, dialogues. How many of you have created these types of components before, or a design system? So yeah, it's a lot of work. And at the same time, these components are a bit special, right? Like they are dangerous to change. You can't just let someone of your team, I will add a margin here, or I will do maybe a padding there, right? It may mess up somewhere because they are used everywhere in your application. And good example of this is we changed recently our dialogues to use the dialogue element instead of teleporting it to the body with a teleport component. And it messed up every single dialogue that we have because a lot of things. And then that means these components have a special consideration here. They need to be changed, they need to be scrutinized, and they need to be tested more thoroughly than any other components in our system. So we would separate them out if we have the time. So that means maybe put them in an NPM package, private NPM package, or even just create a monorepo project for it, like another one called UI or whatever. So the separation mechanism doesn't matter as long as you can apply what we want to do here, which is stricter CI on them, so maybe unit tests even. Like we don't write unit tests, but unit tests for these components will be really helpful. Maybe even a storybook for these components, because you can't be expected to write a storybook for the 800 components, right? Most of them are have high variance, meaning they change a lot. You have to change them a lot because maybe we did a redesign, maybe we did something. But these components are very static. Usually you create them once and they stay there untouched for 6 months maybe, until someone decides something needs a little more polishing. And then we have another idea here, which is we can package domain-specific UI. And what I mean by domain is not like when you create a folder for users. This is the users folder, or this is the posts folder. No, this is not the separation we're talking about. For us, we have almost many apps inside the SAAS. So maybe we can separate all the bot nodes and the bot builder stuff into its own system, because that also doesn't change often. Once we create it, it's done, and we don't want anyone to mess with it, right? So we need to be able to do that. And doing that enables us to do a few things. For example, if we mess up something, like we did a huge migration for menus, let's say we decided to use a new anchor positioning system instead of JavaScript, and then suddenly it can break everywhere in our app. But if we have it as a package that is separated, we can easily revert it, right? We just install the older version and we are done. We don't have to rewrite the changes, and we don't have to revert it in Git or anything like that. All we have to do is just revert the version. So let's talk about composables. Composables are different. They are nested, so we don't have that. We don't treat them as flat anymore because they are TypeScript modules. So yeah, it fits more there, I guess. But we do make use of something called barrel files. Barrel files are index.something files. You probably have seen index.vue, index.js, index.something in a folder. And all it does, it just re-exports everything around that module. So we have here I'm not sure if it's readable or not, but the bot module has a validator, it has a manager, it has a trigger, it has a history for undo and redo and stuff like that. And all of that logic is, each file has its own kind of thing. But we have an index file that re-exports everything there. And the reason for this is we don't want people to keep digging to find the file that you need to import something out of. So it's really common practice that you see in libraries, and yeah. So using barrel files is a bit tricky because you need to abide by certain rules. For example, you shouldn't have any side effects in your barrels, meaning you shouldn't declare constant or declare any kind of logic that would run once the file is evaluated. You can have exports, but you can't have something that has something that would run. Like you can't have a console log, you can't have a function that would immediately run, because that affects the tree shaking capability of that file. So, and another point is you cannot also have circular imports. For example, you have the validator and the manager files. The validator may need something from the manager or vice versa. So you shouldn't have any kind of circular imports between them. And at the same time, maybe the manager can import something from the validator, but at the same time, since we have a barrel file, it can import it from there as well, right? So avoid as much as possible that your modules cannot import anything from that barrel file. If they are part of the barrel, they can't import from the barrel. They import from within themselves. And these rules just make sure that tree shaking is working or would work, because you can easily have dead code in there that would be included just because of one of these couple of issues. So let's talk about how are we building our composables? What does a composable look like? So we don't use Pinia or any kind of store management solution, and that's one of the hot takes, but I will defend that. And feel free to ask me why at the end. But I will get to multiple points around that. So our composables, like this one, the use conversation stream, is responsible for fetching the messages. But it's also responsible for doing a lot of things around that. For example, it fetches the messages, it keeps them, I guess it keeps the data integrity here. And that's done by fetching them in the first place and then maintaining them through WebSockets or server-sent events or pooling, depending on your backend and your needs. And that means we need to have a lot of logic in these composables that make sure that the state stays fresh. So we have a graphical subscription that keeps, that is the real-time aspect of this thing. It also manages pagination, so it exposes a load next and a load previous. Also, it has a couple of event listeners for the document, a visibility change, and that's what happens when a user changes the tab or minimizes the browser and opens it again. So we want to make sure the user is seeing the last messages of that conversation at any given time. And this is extremely important because if you are using a library like a fetching library, right? I won't name any names, but it would normally refetch the entire message stream, right? Every time you change the visibility or you leave the browser, or every 5 minutes or something like that, right? We don't want that. We just interested in the next page. They are not seeing any old messages in there. They are seeing the very last tip of the pagination page. And this kind of small things, small requirements, is what kind of steers us away from using these kinds of libraries. But it's easy, it's really doable. So it's a couple of events, listeners that you can listen for, and you just load the next page whenever any one of them is triggered. And one main, very important thing, and I think you heard it already yesterday and echoed multiple times with the Vue speakers throughout the 2 days here, is no UI coupling at all. This composable does not care what UI you have. It doesn't, in any shape or form, care about what kind of elements, what kind of styling you have. And this is because we want our composables to have the domain or the business logic, and our components to be only responsible for the presentation layer. They present what these composables offer, and nothing more. So something like this, like the conversation stream composable, we use it 3 times. We use it once in the web app, once in the mobile app, and once in the iframe app. And all of them have different representation of that message stream, right? Because audio messages can look different. Video messages will look different in web versus mobile. And when I talk about mobile here, I'm not talking about responsive mobile. I'm talking about a mobile app built with capacitor.js. So it's very specific kind of deployment. So let's talk about the fun part here, which is state management. So with Vue.js 3, I think things changed a lot because it is no longer required that you need a state management solution. You are no longer required to use Vue.js. You're no longer required to use Pinia. And here I make a distinction between need and require. You may need them, but you are not required to use them. And this is a big distinction because previously in Vue.js 2, any Vue.js 2 veterans here? Okay, we have a few. So if you use Vue 2 and you want to share state, like the logged in user, you have to use Vuex, right? Like it's over. It's already over. You have to use it. You are kind of stuck. But today, you don't really need to. If you have a small application, you can get away with just this, maybe. You can export a ref, and congratulations, you just shared your state. You don't need anything else. You import it anywhere else, and you can mutate it, you can read it, and that's done. However, this is, of course, frowned upon because while it's very minimal to set up, while it is type safe and everything, unfortunately, it has an issue, which is unpredictable mutability. So if a change happens, you need to be able to tell what kind of, which component changed it, or what kind of logic changed the state. And this is what you get from the state management libraries most of the time. Another thing is, since any component can read it, or any composable can read it actually, any code you can read it, so any code can write to it as well, which is a bit messy. And one concept I would like to focus on is the ownership. What code, which part of the code owns the state? And by ownership here, I mean which part of the code is allowed to mutate it, right? And that gets lost in these kinds of implementations. So we move on to something that we experimented with, which is provide inject. And I remind you that we started doing all of this 4 years ago. So Pinia wasn't mature yet, and a lot of libraries weren't around then yet. So provide inject. Anyone have used them in their applications? Yeah, they are a bit scary because in Vue 2, there was a big warning in the Vue documentation that told you, do not use this because it's reserved for library authors. And being a library author, I really like the provide inject API. However, I think with Vue 3, it is actually usable in userland today. And I encourage you to do so because it fixed kind of all the issues that it had with Vue 2. It can be typed, and that's through something called injection keys. You can import something called an injection key type, and that can be a string, or it can be a symbol. I prefer symbols because they do not collide with each other, but you can use strings as well. And what that gives you is whenever you provide something, it is type checked. So if you provide the wrong thing, TypeScript will complain, your builds won't build, and your CI will complain, and yeah, that's why we built this whole thing in TypeScript. And when you inject them, you get the full types of it, so you don't have to cast on, and you don't have to do anything weird about that. So it's really easy to use, it's straightforward, however, it has a top-down direction, which means it has a clear ownership. The provider owns the state. So it kind of answers that question. Which component owns the state? The one that provided it, right? Or which composable owns the state? The one that provided it, right? So it kind of answers this question. But it poses a few issues. So first issue is, and this is something you will see more in practice rather than theory. In theory, you provide something, you inject it. What can go wrong, right? Other than your teammates deciding, okay, so imagine that all of you implemented this use current user composable, and I am part of your team. I am a new member in your team, and I need that state in a new component that I'm working on. Do you think I would reach out to inject a key that I don't know about in my component, or would I just call a function called literally use current user? What do you think? I would call the function, right? Use current user. It does what it's advertised, and it would seem it would work just fine. However, what happened here is you just created two user contexts. And I noticed this with my team. Every single person who joined us, left us, and even those who stayed with us did the same very mistake. They would rather use the functions rather than the injection. Because in order to use the injection, you need two pieces of information. What is the key? and if it is provided at all or not, right? Because you can inject it and it may not be there. And then either your app crashes or it's returned as null and a lot of things go wrong. So yeah, and that's a big problem to try to solve. So first pattern to address that is singletons. And singletons are a very old concept, and if you are a backend engineer, Laravel maybe or something like that, you probably make use of them. So, and in JavaScript, it's a fancy way to say I have a global variable that I short circuit if it was already initialized, and that's it. So what I do here is I don't use provide inject. I create my context, I set it, and every time it's called again, it short circuits. So it's only created once, it's a single instance, and every single component will have that state, and everything will seem to be fine. So single instance, like I said, there is no risk of people creating multiple contexts by mistakes, right? However, it has an unclear direction. So let me ask you again, which component owns that state? Yes, it's the composable, yeah, but the component that calls the composable is by definition the one that owns it. But which component owns this state? The current user state. And the answer will be surprising, but it's the very first one that calls this composable. And this is extremely dangerous because you may have a teardown lifecycle hooks, like on before unmount. Maybe you are closing the WebSocket connection. Maybe you are deleting something to free up some memory. Maybe you are doing something along these lines. And what will happen here is so you have a bunch of lifecycle hooks. Which component are they registered against? The very first one that called this composable. And that can be extremely dangerous. So you have a menu component maybe it's the very first one that calls this composable. And then once you click on something, it disappears, and then it has another component that uses the same state. But this one already disappeared, probably unmounted, so it might have already destroyed the state for the other component. And we actually had this bug where our WebSocket library would do that. On unmounted, it would remove the WebSocket connection. And that means the state are no longer kept fresh when this happens. So this is a big side effect of this, and it doesn't really work with composables with argument. Imagine if you have a configuration that you want to send to the current user, right? So how would that work with a singleton, right? So it gets a bit messy here. You might be asking right at this point, why don't you just use Pinia? Like, why are you overcomplicating all of this, right? And Pinia first, if I use Pinia, I would be using the composable version of it, which is like the function that you send that has a setup function, and you can set up stuff like that. I wouldn't use the options version of it because, like you saw in the previous slides, our composables are a bit nuanced. We want some WebSockets there, we want our freshness to be maintained by certain logic and stuff like that. But Pinia actually works exactly like this. So this is Pinia, more or less. If you try the Pinia composition API version of it, which is the setup function that you send as a second argument for define store, it will have the very same issue. If you have on before unmounted or before unmounted, it would run for the very first component that initializes the store and never again. So it's not reliable to rely on lifecycle hooks with this kind of pattern. So I would say maybe you can use it as long as you are absolutely sure that you are not using any lifecycle hooks and your libraries that you are importing, third-party libraries, aren't doing the same. So that's a little of a high bar to make sure of. Let's talk about self-inject, which is the second pattern that is interesting here. So what we do here, instead of having a singleton, in our own composable, we would check if it's already injected and short circuit to that instead. And what would happen is it will initialize only once, and it will seem to be work exactly the same as a singleton, but better because it's a top-down direction, meaning that very highest component that called it, that provided the thing, owns the thing. So when it's very safe to use lifecycle hooks against that kind of thing. And that component is the owner of that state, so it's very safe to do that. And it hides away the implementation details, which is what we are trying to do with these couple of patterns, right? We want our users our developers, so your teammates to be able to just use current user, and they don't have to care where they are, where the state is coming from, right? And this is why we are trying to do all of this. The only con with this is you may end up with multiple instances if you aren't careful. So when does this happen? Provide inject works as when you provide something, it's provided for that tree of components. However, you can have two components that they are not related in the same tree that can provide the same thing. And then you have to create two instances of that thing. So we make use of both of these patterns. For example, something like current user, we use a singleton pattern. But other stuff, we use this because it's much safer to tear down. And that's about it here for state management. Let's talk about performance. So these are the current numbers that we have for our SPA app. So it's not green, it's not 100%, right? So it's fine. However, we learned a lot from these metrics. So I really like the current state of Core Web Vitals because it gives you different aspects about how your app is performing. For example, CLS, which is the cumulative layout shift, it measures the layout stability. So that's extremely important in an app like ours. So app like ours is an inbox, and if your UI is dancing around, you may have a CSS performance issue, or your users may just not like it, right? Like they are waiting for the UI to stabilize, and that's not a good thing. The new metric, which is interaction to next paint, I really love this metric in particular because it measures the interactiveness of your application throughout the user journey. It's not like how fast is your app when it first loads. No, it's when they leave the page, the numbers are crunched and they are averaged and sent to Google. So it's really good indication of how interactive, how responsive your app is. And we are doing well on that front, which was surprising to me, but yeah. And then we have the FCP and the LCP. So first contentful paint and largest contentful paint. But they are too volatile for our app to be useful for us. Yes, they are the worst two performers we have. Maybe it's a bit biased to just say, oh, we don't care about these, but there is a reason for that. So our users have very different things. Our users see totally different things from one another. Everyone sees a different inbox. One user may have an inbox full of images. Another may have an inbox full of text messages, right? So the LCP would definitely be calculated against when the image is loaded, when the largest image is loaded. So it's too volatile. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's very bad. The average is bad, but yeah, it's too volatile for us for it to be useful. So let's talk about how to improve these metrics. So for CLS, it's basically around making sure your media ratio and size are known before rendering. And we do that with the backend. The backend, whenever it receives a message that has an image or a video, it calculates its width, height, and it sends that with the payload to the front end. So the front end knows how much space it needs to preserve or reserve for that image. So, and then we have the lazy elements, lazy images, lazy iframes, stuff like that. Make sure to reserve space for them. Also loading states, when you are switching between loading and not loading, make sure your UI doesn't shift. Like the loading state should be the same height width as the content it's trying to hide. Same thing for animations and transitions. You shouldn't transition or animate two elements that have two different dimensions because that will cause a layout shift as well. And then you have something a little annoying, which is scrollable containers. And this is the reason why we aren't having complete zero number on our CLS, because we have a list that once it's loaded, a scroll bar pops up, and that causes a layout shift. You can reserve a space for it with CSS, but it's not worth it. Again, these are just recommendations to improve your scores, but they are not rules. And then I forgot about this one, async persistence. So we have something like a resizable sidebar in our application, and we want to save it to the current user device. You can use two things. You can use local storage, or you can use indexed DB, right? The issue with IndexedDB is it's asynchronous, meaning it starts off with the default value that you have defined, meaning the user would notice that the sidebar is at the wrong size, then suddenly it shifts to the configured size, right? But with local storage, it will immediately, because it's synchronous, it will immediately load to the correct size, which the one they have set previously. So take that into consideration. Again, I'm not saying use local storage, we use both. So yeah, for interaction to next paint, it's really easier said than done, but just respond to clicks. Whenever the user taps something anywhere in your application, make sure, as long as there's an interactive element, like a button or something, make sure to react to that. If they click a button for submit maybe, show a loader. That simple act of showing a loader will improve your score with INP, because INP tests when the next paint happened after an action is taken. So you need to respond fast to that user, even if there isn't much to do. Like maybe they are loading the next page, but just don't leave them hanging. Show a overlay, tell them they are loading the next state. Communicate with them, and that's why I really like this metric, because it encourages you to communicate to the user that something is going on. And I really like that. Another way to, one issue we have, I think, is our modules that are lazily loaded. So view router routes, and you probably have seen this. Most of the time we define our routes as a synchronous route, right? So that we don't bloat the bundle with every single route, with every single dependency, right? We do that as a best practice. However, there is a side effect that shows up because of this. When you click a router link, there is a small delay before it navigates to the next page. And this happens because it needs to load the JavaScript, it needs to load the CSS, and everything that it needs to load that page. So that's a bit annoying for the users, because it makes them seem like your app isn't reactive. And it's considerably visible if you have a very huge pages with a lot of dependencies. So you can experiment. I don't have a solution for that, to be honest. You can experiment with preloading them. Maybe when they hover over a router link, maybe try to preload the JavaScript files so that they don't have to wait for them. You can try that. I'm not sure. Different frameworks try different things, and I think Next already does some kind of things around that area to alleviate it, but it's not bulletproof at all. Another framework like Quick, it would, as long as the user is idle, it would keep downloading these routes. So is that a good idea? I'm not sure. It's definitely bandwidth intensive, but it gives them what they need, that the app is fast and it's loading its pages faster. With FCP and LCP, again, they are too volatile, but one way we can fix that is through caching. So our frontend has zero caching. We don't cache any data that comes from the backend. And the main reason is we are a real-time application. People take decisions based on what they see. And if they see some old message and they do something wrong, it can be the wrong decision, and it may cost them a customer. So we can't just make that decision, let's cache everything and just refetch it whenever, right? We can't make that decision. So I would say be careful about caching, because it depends on your application. For us, we can do that, but we can use it as a way to improve the FCP and the LCP, because the inbox would load immediately, right? And that would give us exactly what we need. However, yeah, we are trying to figure out how do we communicate to the user what you are saying is stale data and you should wait for the new one. And if we figure that one out, then we can start adding cache to our application. Quick note on lazy loading. So as a best practice, you lazy load everything that pretty much isn't immediately visible to the user, right? We are encouraged to do that. However, there is a side effect that you need to be aware of. Here in this example, we have a command palette, like a command K palette, like the MacBook command space bar kind of thingy. And we are loading a specific command, and that needs its own component. So when the user clicks, they have to wait for the component to be refetched, parsed, and then run or executed. And then that components need to make another GraphQL request to get data. And the total is around 100, I think, a second and 100 milliseconds, something around that time, which is way too much. These times, again, I'm from Egypt. Our servers are in United States, so there is a bit of latency here, maybe a lot of latency, but at the same time, we can avoid this by just not lazy loading, and it suddenly drops to 600 milliseconds, so, or 800. So it takes as much as the longest request would take. And here I would say you have to optimize for the user experience rather than your technical assessment. So is it fine for the user to click this and wait, or do you have to do something about it? Should you add a loader in? Maybe tell them you are doing something. Again, be responsive about it. Or maybe you just don't do lazy loading at all. So I would say be picky about what you lazy load, especially in these kinds of applications. Now, let's talk about tests quickly, and I will try to be quick. So with tests, we just use Playwright. We don't have unit tests. That's a hot take, because we are 6 engineers. And end-to-end tests gives us higher yield of coverage against the time we invest in them, because I can try to test the inbox, like let's say I want to try to test sending an image. How much test do you think I would need to do to reach that point? Like I need to test that I can write a message, send it, and it shows up in the message stream. At least 5 components are involved already, and if you don't count the conversation list, which needs to update the last message, so that's 6, maybe 7, 8, and then you have almost half the app in a unit test, or maybe an integration test, and that's not feasible. So, and if you have a lot of state, lots of stores, lots of provide injects, you have to mock a lot, right? I absolutely despise every time I have to mock a store or the view router or everything. It's easy, yes, but once you have like maybe 5 stores involved in this page that you are testing, you have to mock 5 things over and over for every single test. And then you start investing in writing abstractions that make it easier for you to mock. But then it feels like a waste of time to me. So I can just mock our API requests with mock service worker, run them against Playwright, and just run our app against it. And it already covered a lot of the things here. So I would say what you need to unit test is probably your design system components. These are the ones to unit test. These cannot afford to fail. But everything else, like this the mission critical path. Can you send a message? If yes, then anything else is secondary, right? And this test, which is very simple, we have this quick brown fox jumps, which is a very famous message because we want to test every single character that gets sent. And if it works, then everything else is secondary. And that's the main point here. Quick thing, Rasail is an app with relatively long sessions. That's a tip for the next slide. So 74 days, can you guess what that number refers to? Okay. So that's how long someone didn't reload their browser while using Rasail. And it might sound surprising but these users exist because when you are building something, you are not typically the user of that thing, right? But consider something like VS Code. How many times do you completely quit it and open it again? Maybe if it's taking too much RAM or battery, you do that, but otherwise you leave it open, right? Indefinitely. So we are building an application that is similar for these sales and customer support people. They would keep it open. Why would they close it? And this happens. And this causes the next issue, which is asset version skew. And this is really annoying because let's say you just store your last build on the server and then you have 2 clients. One guy that is fresh and another is maybe 2 hours old or something. So what will happen is if they request a lazy component or something, one guy will 404, which is an old one because it no longer exists, and the other will 200, and it will be returned for them. And this is really an annoying issue to fix. So one way to fix it is let's just keep all the build artifacts. Let's not delete anything. Let's just keep everything. And that way, of course, you can clean it up every 6 months, but maybe you get a user that never reloaded their app in 6 months, so who knows? Right, so 200, you get 200s in these cases because you kept all the artifacts on your CDN. So surely this works really well, right? Like there is no way this fails. I was hesitant about this next slide, but I hope it's fine. Yeah, that doesn't work. So the reason why it doesn't work is when you are building your app, you generate a hash for that asset, right? And then another laptop generates a different hash for the same file with the same data. Why is that? And then your CI does the same thing. So it's totally different hashes every single time. And this is because while the same machine will produce the same hashes over and over for the same content, it's not true across multiple machines. And this is because most of the hash generators rely on something on the machine itself, like some information about that CPU or something that changes that. I think Vite fixed that, but if you are still stuck on Webpack, you are seeing this today probably. I think Vite fixed it, starting from version 5. But again, this was 4 years ago, so yeah, we had this issue. So whenever we would run the CI, a different hash would be produced because it's a different Docker image, it's a different machine, basically. So that was a bit annoying. So we needed a hash that will never change for that release. And we use Git for that, right? So we just get the short commit hash and inject it into the Vite config and force the hashes to have that instead of the automatically generated hashes. And that gives us deterministic builds that we know what if you just look at the file, you already know what commit it came from. And you can easily debug around that, and you can easily do a lot of things around that. And here is what it looks like. We have a build folder, and then you have the same components, but with the commit hash. And that gives you a lot of flexibility in doing some crazier stuff. For example, we recently went through a redesign, and we wanted some users to have access to that redesign while others wouldn't. And we can easily do that now with the backend. The backend can now suddenly point the front end, okay, load this release, or load that release, or load that release, and that's based on commits. We can literally change the design based on the commit now because of that. Now let's talk about the API version skew. So when you deploy an application, you have a couple of issues. Again, remember that a user may not have reloaded their app in a while. So you may have a situation where a new front end is talking to an old backend, or an old front end is talking to a new backend. And that's a big problem because it causes issues like this. First, the front end is newer, so to the backend, it's from the future. Maybe it's requesting a field that doesn't exist yet. And then that will cause errors in your application. And then you have maybe the backend is a bit newer and the front end is old, and then the front end doesn't know which version it's stuck on. Like, I am requesting this field, and the backend says it's deprecated. So something like that. So one way to fix that, you can easily say, okay, why not just do backward compatibility still? Just make sure your API changes are backward compatible. And that's easier said than done, but again, your user may not have reloaded the app in 74 days, so can you guarantee nothing breaking will ship in that period? We ship maybe 20 times a day, so for us, no, that doesn't happen. So there is no guarantee. So what we do instead is we version it also with the commit hash. So we have now a version on the front end and on the back end, and that's read from the package.json file. It's literally like you are versioning a package. And this is called the pre-release version, which we just make sure it's the commit hash. So what do we do here exactly? The backend returns a header, and it tells basically the front end, I'm expecting this version to communicate with me, right? And we break it down in how we detect the skew here, like how we want to deal with that skew. So first, we parse the build time version and the API header. So the front end will have that hard-coded in it via a defined variable or something, or read it from package.json. You can do anything you want as long as it is specific for that build. And then we read the header. And then we do that for every single request. So every time the front end sends a request to the backend, it checks that. It checks the API header version. And then it breaks down the difference. So if we have a pre-release, which is a commit changes, then no, we shouldn't do anything about that. It's just something changed that doesn't have to involve the user. Because if you ship 20 times a day, would you force the user to reload 20 times a day? That's not feasible. So if we have a batch change, then we give them a soft prompt. Hey, we fixed something. Maybe you should reload, or maybe don't. It's up to you. If it's a minor change, we tell them, hey, you really need to reload something. We changed something that's a bit important. Or if it's a major change, we completely block the app then. So, and these are the different kind of prompts that we have. If it's a soft one, we just give them the choice. Second one, yeah, you may want to reload. They can still dismiss it. But then we have the big one, which will block their app entirely and will tell them, you really need to reload. The frontend cannot talk to the backend at the moment. So, and that means we need to version these versions responsibly, right? It means we as humans, we still have to kind of bump the releases ourselves, which is a bit annoying, but it's the best that we can do with the resources that we have. We think maybe we can use change sets in the future to automate that in a way, but we aren't sure how. We aren't really, this isn't hurting us. This is completely fine for us at the moment. So maybe later. One cool thing about this is we can also track the releases by their easily with Sentry or any kind of error tracking software that you use. And yeah, we can tell now the commit that produced this without any kind of having to hook up Sentry to your Git or anything like that. So I will finish with this. Another number. Can you guess what this number refers to? I added this today to the slides, so it's something relevant that happened today. And since we don't have a lot of guesses, this is someone's Chrome version that had an issue this very week. So Chrome 84 released 4 years ago. So some guy is ignoring the update button on Chrome for 4 years, is using our app, and something broke for them. And yeah, so that's the kind of stuff you have to deal with. With this particular guy, we just told them, just update your browser. Like, come on. And yeah, that's about it. So I'm done. I will take any questions if you have any. Yeah. No questions? Okay.
I have a bunch of small questions.
Sure.
I don't even know which one I want to ask. Okay, how about with Playwright? Do you guys use like the Palm approach at all? Or do you know what I'm talking about? Like it's like an approach that they were. I don't know if they were promoting it, was in their documentation, where you kind of create like a page object model.
Yes, we do.
Okay, I found that I hated that.
I hate it as well.
And the reason why is because it made so much sense when they're selling it, because it's like, hey, let's, in a class base, derive things like home, .header, .navigation. The problem with onboarding, you have to teach somebody an entire documentation system that doesn't, or entire system that doesn't exist anywhere. Where, like, when, like, say, like a Cypress shop or like a Playwright, where it's more function based, they just read the docs, right? You just read the docs and you know how to select the thing on the page. So I didn't know if you guys had experienced anything like that, or if there's a way around that, or get the same.
We are kind of dancing around it by not using it too much. Like for a page like the inbox page, we have to visit it a lot. We have to click things a lot in it. So we kind of have to use this pattern there. But for other things, any other pages, we don't enforce it. Like just write selectors and write your test, and that's it. Not at the moment, no. Yeah. Do we use what? Sorry? No. It's all mocked with mock service worker. So the backend has their own unit tests. They are doing way better job at this than us at the front end, but yeah, they have their own unit test, and our test only hit the mocked API with mock service worker. Okay, I think let's wrap up, and you can ask me after this. So thank you all. It was an honor to fly here and talk to you. And yeah, I hope to see you again somewhere in the future.